You're listening to TeaLife Audio, a podcast about the Japanese way of tea and related arts. For show notes and other resources, go to tealife.audio.
Welcome to episode 159. My name is Anthony.
My name is TJ.
And my name is Lindsey.
So, welcome everybody. It's great to be together again in the most wonderful time of the year as we prepare for Halloween. Yeah. Everybody thought I was going to say Christmas. No. It's Halloween.
I agree that this is the most wonderful time of the year for sure.
Oh yeah. It's absolutely, I don't know what it's like up in your part of the country, Anthony, but here in Colorado right now it is. We had a lot of moisture over the summer, so our leaves this year are mind-blowingly beautiful, just so bright.
Mine are just starting to turn, and it's just not I don't know if there's been frost yet, but definitely very cold mornings, and it's my favorite.
Yeah, me too. So today we have with us one of my wonderful tea friends, Lindsey Higo, and I'm really, really thrilled to welcome her. She has been on before, many, many moons ago, but we're really grateful to have her back today. Lindsey, do you want to just tell all the people at home a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Lindsey Higo. I am an Urasenke practitioner. I've been studying tea for, I want to say, almost 15 years now. The number keeps changing, depending on when we remember how old we are. But I've been studying tea in Colorado almost the whole time I've been studying. I spent some time in Kyoto, and TJ and I do a lot of tea together.
Lucky you.
I'm glad that we're lucky to have a good community here, especially, and it's growing. So,
we invited Lindsey on today because, we've reached that point in our cycle of talking about festivals and holidays where we can't escape the inevitable conversation about Halloween. So, very excited to talk about the wonders of spooky tea.
Not a very traditional Japanese holiday, right?
This is true. This
not
is
at
very
all.
true. What they do Halloween in Shinjuku? Is that right? Is that where it happens?
They do have a big one in Shinjuku. They've actually started cracking down on it this year, actually, because the last 2 years have gotten a little out of control. Not just folks in costumes, but it's basically a big street party in Shinjuku, and they're tightening up the rules quite a bit. But that is one of the larger quote unquote Halloween celebrations that takes place in Japan. So,
I mean, I'm really excited that we're having this conversation, and I'm appreciative that you raised that immediately, Anthony, that this is not traditional.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is, to me, this very interesting sort of tension that arises as we are practicing a traditional Japanese cultural art outside of its context, outside of Japan. And, I get into this conversation with people all the time about the sort of honoring the old and respecting the tradition in its sort of quote unquote pure form, and also being really authentic to my own context, my own culture, trying to find those places where I can bring these two important parts of myself into conversation with one another.
Yeah, and they are your traditions, right? So you're bringing your traditions into this traditional tea. So I think it's very valid and great that you do so.
Yeah, I mean, do you find yourself doing this with other festivals and holidays?
Well, not really. I don't find myself very attached to the traditional American traditions. I'll be honest here. Maybe it's too early to out myself here about Halloween, but Halloween was always spoiled for me as a kid, as I wasn't so big into like superheroes or dressing up and and I never really liked chocolate as a kid. So, and 90% of the candy you get, well, trick-or-treating is chocolate. So the holiday is not something I'm very attached to, and I'd say that about other holidays, religious holidays, or anything. I mean, I like the family gathering aspect of it, but any of the, let's say, traditional culture besides that is sort of, doesn't have a ton of meaning to me or my life. And it should with my child. That kind of makes me want to have more traditions and more meaning on them. And I don't think I've ruined Halloween for him, but Halloween, he has the same kind of feeling as me, and I don't know if I somehow said it or influenced him, but he doesn't. He has the same feelings towards Halloween. But that's why I like having tea in my life, because that gives me things that I do that do really resonate with me and my family, and with my wife being Japanese, it's kind of can be those traditional Japanese holidays can be our traditions. So I don't find myself doing that, but I think if I did really connect with any of these things, I certainly would.
Yeah, that raises a lot of, like, I don't know, just what you're saying makes me think about, like, why do I love Halloween so much? And it's not because it was some special thing when I was a kid. In fact, as a kid, I don't think it was a holiday that I was that into. But as I've grown up, Halloween for me is this, like, it's a mixture of what we were talking about already, this feeling of the fall and these changes and the days are getting colder and darker. So there's that piece. But I also really love, like, campy, spooky.
Okay.
Like, I don't like bloody guts, scary as crap Halloween. Like, no thanks.
Okay.
Not interested. But, like, give me a good, like, Bela Lugosi style vampire rising up out of a creaking coffin, or some ghosts that are just sheets. And we are spot on. That is the kind of Halloween that I want. And I don't know, there's just something about that, like, dark, spooky feeling. You know, Lindsey and I joke a lot, like, Disney's Haunted Mansion that's Halloween to me. That is what, like, cobwebs and jack-o'-lanterns and funny creaky noises coming from another room. Like, that's the vibe I want to feel this time of year. And it makes some part of me so happy.
Okay.
That I can't not do it in the tea room. Like, I just want to soak in that feeling this time of year.
Well, when you present it like that, I also all of those things, but let's say that's not normally what I think of really when I think of Halloween. So yeah.
And now I will rain on both of your parades because I love all of it. I was the kid who planned my costume months in advance, counted out my candy, took the best ones from my little sister. In Colorado, you had to plan your Halloween costume around a jacket because one of the first snows would often be around Halloween. So winter would start when Halloween arrived. And so I was always super excited about it. I am also a goth, so I live for all of those things that are dark and spooky and creepy, but also campy. Like, TJ and I have spent more hours than is probably healthy talking about a Haunted Mansion Chaji, where we do everything from food or making the koshikake machiai into a paper mache dune buggy from the ride. Like, it gets wild sometimes. So I'm over here on the totally other end of the spectrum, where someone just has to give a suggestion of something spooky, and I'm like, yes, 100%, take it to level 1000. Let's go. We're all across the spectrum here today, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and this is why I wanted Lindsey to come on and talk with us about this, because she and I do try to do a Halloween Chaji almost every year. And we've sort of run the gamut, if you want to say it that way, of going big and going subtle and everything in between. Where's the line? Where's what is too far? At what point have we gone too far and left behind chado and gone into, I don't know what, some kind of Halloween fantasy world where there's tea, you know? So it's such a, on one hand, I feel like there's this incredible space that we have found around this Halloween chaji that we do, of really being able to break outside of the box and ask some really rich questions about our practice of tea. And I also think probably we've both encountered places in this conversation over the years where it's like, in hindsight, that may have been a bit much, or it didn't really work. And I also think, and Lindsey, here I'm thinking about the chaji we did last year. I think last year we like put it in its coffin and nailed it shut, and it was perfect. Like it was so,
it
worked really well.
And that chaji, just to give a little bit of context, if you don't mind. So we had talked through a couple iterations of how we wanted it to look, and that's I should also say TJ and I tend to do like 3 to 4 chajis a year, bare minimum, right? So we're really, really constantly always thinking of those things. And in particular, last year's we had 2 sets of guests, so we did 2 chaji back to back.
Oh wow!
Literally in the same day. It was a lot for the host side, but we had our first 5 guests were some older senior community members. We had some high-ranking teachers, folks that hadn't really engaged with tea meeting a Western tradition as much as some non-Japanese tea practitioners might. Maybe there was a tea bowl with like Halloween little bats and pumpkins on it in their experience, but they hadn't really had a full-on, as TJ put it, an extravaganza in relation to a chaji. And then our second group, which was later in the evening, was some more community members that were a little bit younger and had been to some of our chajis in the past. And so we were able to kind of create the same chaji for both of them, but also adjust in ways that would make sense for each set of guests. And so that's how we landed on the theme of doing yokai, so Japanese monsters. So we were able to create this really, really subtle chaji earlier in the afternoon for our first set of guests, where the utensils that we used referenced certain things, and we kept the lighting in the room really low. But at the same time, it was things that would be recognizable to our more traditional guests, right? So some of the foods that we served, we stuck with fall foods. We made some references to different yokai, like the kappa, cucumbers. So the pickles that we served were a pickled cucumber, to kind of give some really subtle references. And then in the evening, we kind of cranked those same elements up. The room was lit by candlelight once the sun went down. We served a different kind of sake than the one we served earlier in the day that had a little bit more of an autumn spice to it. There was a couple more tricks of light that we used, things like that made it so that we could really work on both ends of our guest spectrum. And finding that theme was something that took a lot of effort to make happen, right? Because every time we had to kind of check each set of guests against the other one, of like, how are we creating an equal experience, but also giving them something authentic and something that's going to resonate with them. And I think TJ, I say this all the time to you. I say, what are the vibes that we're giving for this chaji? It's not just about the utensils. It's not just about referencing the season. What is the feeling that we want to land on? And particularly with spooky tea in recent years, we come down to this where we don't say, oh, we want it to be scary. I say, I want you walking down down a path in the forest late at night, and like the moon is full and the leaves are rustling, and you turn around because you think you heard a movement, but you're not sure. So we're building a chaji based on an entire feeling or a narrative sometimes, rather than just saying it's Halloween, we have to get pumpkins and leaves out.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to let people know, when Lindsey says like this particular chaji, this yokai chaji that we did, went through like 4 or 5 iterations and stuff, she means that we were planning this chaji for about 2.5 years. Like, this has been an ongoing, like, we wanted to do this theme, and we've been sort of cooking and, nope, we're not ready to do it. Let's come back to it next year. Let's keep talking about it. Like, something's just not landing. This has been an ongoing process of trying to find, how would this work? And it really, like Lindsey said, it boiled down to this idea of, it's not about the theme. It's not about making people see a yokai, or, bringing in some tea bowl that has a fox on it or something. It's more about what is the feeling that we want our guests to experience in this space.
Yeah, and tea has such a vibe in itself, right? And so it's kind of interesting to approach it to create this other vibe, not this theme to have this tea vibe with, but and I'm gonna overuse the word vibe because it just seems like that's what you kind of were going for, which I like that idea a lot. But I will admit, in your explanation, I didn't hear anything so over top. Was this one of the more tame Halloween Shaji?
Yeah, I definitely think it was, but we did some of the what I would consider over the top things. Again, having the room lit completely by candlelight the second time around. We used a black teoke, a black bucket for the mizusashi, and it was black lacquer. So when you looked inside, it was like a deep, dark well, right? And in the evening, the later ones, it was like just this void in the tamiza, right? Like there was just this blackness in the tamiza, and you could see the glow of the furrow just kind of on the other side. And we used a white glass chaire, so we had this kind of very striking dogu that wasn't it wasn't super colorful or thematic like we said, but it was very, very striking and created this whole kind of like, out of the darkness, here comes this one thing, like ghosts coming out of the dark or things like that, really focusing. So even though it wasn't over the top in what we consider in like the Western sense, it created a very, very intense reaction when you saw these items, right? A tea reaction. Because it's like, why are you using a water bucket in fall? It's, 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside and the wind is blowing and it's going to snow tomorrow. Why are we using this quintessentially summer thing? Well, think about water, deep wells, what comes out of the dark, things that...
We've all seen The Ring.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. We have all seen The Ring. So like, again, creating that unsettling vibe of what's going on over there. And especially with the other thing about yokai that we also talked a lot about was yokai tend to be something that isn't quite what you would imagine, or something that was once something else. Like the chochino bake is a lantern that has become used or tattered and torn, and then it transforms into this monster, for lack of better word. So there's the added element of everything in the room, in the tea room, is not quite what it seems, but you're not sure what that is. So using some utensils to kind of, again, enhance those vibes. And like you said, we're going to use vibes a lot, but I think we do a lot of this vibe checking in tea without realizing it, right? If we sit down during cherry blossom season, we can sit in the tea room and every piece of dogu can have cherry blossoms on it. But in Colorado, there's no cherry blossoms in our state, right? So the way that we're creating that abundance is through our utensils. Or, we decide it's time to have a hanami chaji when we see the lilac bush blooming in Colorado, right? Like we're creating seasonality in our home areas without even realizing it. Things that Japanese people would recognize as, oh, that's spring, or oh, that's fall. We do the same thing in Western states, right? Without even being totally cognizant of it. And I think we create those vibes in tea, whether we mean to or not, which is kind of cool. I think that's an added layer of tea that people don't always realize, especially when they're planning chaji, is where's the balance between shoving seasonality in your face and having everyone in the room go, ah, yes, it's spring, or ah, yes, it's autumn. Like, where is that balance? And that's something that I think makes a really good chaji.
Well, and I think using cherry blossoms is such a great sort of juxtaposition. And it's also a great way to highlight just what you're saying, Lindsey, that I think most people, when they do a hanami chaji, they're really just thinking, oh, I mean, it's spring, right? Let's just do hanami. But we all sort of have an emotional reaction or experience, and it could be quite different, but we all have a reaction when the flowers bloom after the winter. We all have a reaction, those of us who have had the great opportunity to be in Japan and see the cherry blossoms, we understand why this matters. We understand there's this like, it's incredibly beautiful. And also, I think, of course, I'm tuned into this particular element of it because it's what the Buddhists all want to talk about. But the sort of transience or impermanence of cherry blossoms, the fact that they're so brief, and even when you touch the petals, they're almost translucent. There's a lot of emotion around cherry blossoms. And so whether, like Lindsey said, whether you're trying to create a vibe or not, the vibe is actually what the chaji is about in that sense. It's not just about seeing pretty dogu, it's about the feelings that come up in relationship to the seasonal points that we're naming.
Mm.
We have all kinds of feelings that emerge in relationship to what's happening in the space of the tea room. And Halloween has just become this incredibly fun time to like lean into a feeling that is for me incredibly nourishing. That spooky vibe that isn't scary. It's just on the fun side of scary for me. That's what I'm looking for. It's just on the happy side of scared. And this chaji that we did last year that Lindsey was talking about, we did go a little bit more subtle than we have in the past. You know, we didn't just use this black teoke, we used a black raku for our chawan. The chaide is frosted glass, but it lives in a black shifuku. Like everything was black. There was all this darkness and shadow and void. And even in the late afternoon seki that we did, we closed all the blinds. So it was really like dusky, you know, in that room. And we used like a big sort of rough shaped spider mom as the hana, which is a little big for the tea room. Like it really felt like, oh, that's a strong flower. And I did put it in bronze. You know, I put it in like a bronze tsurukube or tsurukubi vase. So it had that elevated feeling. But what really was helpful to me, so one of the people who came to that first seki is the senior most teacher in Omotesenke in the region. And she's in her 80s and has been doing tea since she was 6 years old. She is this unbelievably wonderful resource that we have here in Colorado. And she came and she got it. Like Halloween, like you said, Anthony, totally outside of her context, right? Like she's lived in the States long enough, she knows what Halloween is, but it doesn't land for her as anything other than a sort of cultural observance with no real depth because she didn't grow up here. But she said afterwards, oh yeah, it feels creepy. You know, everything feels a little creepy, but she was smiling.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece that comes into this, and we're going to juxtapose the yokai chaji with a spooky tea that we did several years ago that we'll talk about in a minute. The sort of structure, or if you want to use the word container, that holds all of this is that even when we have gone much bigger, we don't break the structure of chaji. So everything that we come up with, kooky as it might be, lives within the framework, within the outline of a chaji. Mm-hmm. So we're not adding pieces and we're not taking major pieces away. We're just finding ways to do that piece that aligns with the theme or with a vibe that we're trying to create. In the past, we have done chaji where we actually have put tricks into the room. Like there have been some reveals or some zingers. This chaji, we didn't really do that, which was also really fun in a way, because I mean, this is this may hit some people wrong, and I don't mean for it to be upsetting to anyone, but I think early on when we started doing these spooky teas, both of us felt a kind of a need to have, for lack of a better word, a reveal. Something that was like a zing, gotcha. Oh, didn't see that coming, did you? Mm-hmm. And last year, for the first time, I did not feel that the chaji needed it. Like, it felt so rich and so complete as we were building it, that it didn't need something that did that, because the whole thing felt like it was holding a particular feeling throughout. And I think some of that is just that, we're deepening into our relationship to the practice, and we're becoming more fluent on one level and more confident on another level in how we move through this kind of a space.
Did the need or the previous need to have some like gotcha, did that come from the fact that it was a Halloween themed tea, or was it just something that comes from just doing chaji in general? Or
for me, that big reveal came from, we always see a scroll and a flower in a chaji. Obviously not at the same time, but we always see them. And a lot of us work in communities and in spaces where our dogu is very finite. So I can't just open a closet and pick up from 100 scrolls. Our entire community has the same 10 to 20 that we can pick from for anything. And so for me, it was like, even if I have to use utensils that I see every day, how do I make those utensils? How do I make that pop? And that's, I think, where the reveal comes from, is all of my guests are coming and they've seen the scroll 100 times. This is not going to get them to the place where they should be and having the full feeling they should have in a chaji, right? I think there's a question of authenticity sometimes. Are we creating chaji to just do chaji? TJ and I oftentimes will also contextualize a chaji by saying, is this a keiko chaji or is this a chaji chaji? I see those two things as very separate from each other. And I know in a lot of folks' tea communities, keiko chaji is chaji. And that's beautiful because you're getting to do chaji, but sometimes for us, keiko stops at the door for a chaji. This is no longer a keiko space. And in creating that, that's part of what we're containing it in, right? And so that's where the need for a reveal comes from, is like, this needs to be beyond interacting with it every day. And I think as we reach, like TJ was saying, a little bit more of our tea maturity or tea, deepening of our understanding of tea, that becomes more nuanced. I can tell the difference, but honestly, sometimes my guests may not be able to, especially if they're guests that are coming from somewhere where that boundary between keiko chaji and chaji chaji, I have no other word to call it, is less defined, or is not as defined as what we would define it here. And so it's hard for them to go, oh, well, I saw that scroll 3 weeks ago at the Autumn Keiko, and now it's here for a chaji. I don't know how to articulate that feeling, but I think we've all felt it, where we walk into the room and we go, yes, of course it is it's New Year's and the scroll is, pines are 1,000 years green, right? Like we've all walked into the room and it's like, of course. And so creating the reveal was something that felt like it just made it extra special.
Mm-hmm.
And the bigger the reveal, the more special it was, including me kneeling on the ground under the tea house and pulling a string to get a gate to open by itself. Again, there have been some really excessive things that probably don't need to happen again.
Oh, but I'm so glad they did.
Right? But I think having done some of these more, let's call them extreme reveals, we can now have a really specific and nuanced conversation of, okay, if we want to have a reveal, how do we do it in a way that honors our guests, that honors the theme of what we're doing, and keeps it within that chaji structure without it being too wild and too out there.
Well, I also personally have experienced, as I've gotten deeper into my practice, how I relate to more subtle cues and more subtle images has changed. And what now for me is incredibly subtle but deeply impactful, and I feel it, really strongly. 10 years ago, it would have gone right over my head. And I think that in the same way as hosts and as people building these chaji, I think we've deepened into a place where like our palette has become a lot more subtle, and we don't feel the need for something to be in your face and blatant. Whereas early on, like that was still, I think we were both still in a place where we were trying to build something, and it was like, yeah, we got to beat the guests over the head with this or they won't catch it.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's kind of like, well, if they miss it, they miss it. They weren't paying attention. It's okay. They got something, right? They may not get everything. They may not get every breadcrumb we've left them, but but I don't feel the need anymore to like curate the experience to every detail for each person. Rather, we've moved into this vibe space versus, nope, I need you to follow the story word for word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the chaji where you were under the tea house pulling strings?
Sure. We did a chaji that referenced a magical universe, that which maybe shall not be named anymore, but at the time it was still in the cultural zeitgeist. And so we planned a chaji for 4 guests, and it was in the small tea house we have in Boulder, which is a freestanding tea house. It has it's not even one mat, Misia. So you get a crock pot and a heating pad to have your entire kaiseki meal come out warm. So it is already a challenge.
It requires magical.
Yes, a room of requirement is required.
Yes.
So we planned out a meal, and this was actually the first time, it must have been 2016, because this was the first time we used the bento or chaji.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than having everything come out on the trays with, 3 bowls or your 2 bowls and your mukosuke and having multiple dishes come out, we took the entire kaiseki and packed it bento style. But it wasn't a tenshin. It was still that 80% full requirement. Like this was a full box. And every dish in there hit all the points in the meal that you needed to. We had mukosuke, we had yakimono, we had ainamono, we had rice. And then, so it all came out at once. And it referenced, TJ was talking about breadcrumbs. Each food item in there, I curated a menu to reference specific instances in that series. So using an egg dusted with gold leaf to reference a phoenix, using so many things. And
you used that egg that was in gold leaf, and you put little things on the side of it, so it looked like the snitch.
Oh, that's what I was thinking.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
I did.
It looked like the snitch.
And so I hand cut out vegetables in certain shapes. We exchanged everyone's sensus for wands and the koshikake machiai. But we really kind of like went over the top with some of those things. But in the limited space that we had, that was, those were places that we could make those adjustments. But the reason I was under the tea house, because I'm sure that's all everyone wants to know, is one, how do you get under the tea house? So the freestanding tea house is on risers, right? Because it is its own little building. We've all seen that. And when the host comes out to greet the guests and pour the water into the sukubai and do the silent bow, he leaves the gate tegakari, so people know that it's time to enter, right? And rather than having him TJ reach over and open the gate, we used fishing line and we tied it to the gate and we ran it underneath the tea house. And I was standing on the other side out of sight. And, he said the magic word and I yanked on the gate really hard and it just slowly swung open. And I couldn't see any of this happening. So I just heard, just gasps, right? And so, but again, in order to do that, we had to go to kind of an extreme length that now I would be like, no, we're not doing that again. We had that. That was the first time we used the cauldron with dry ice as a mizusashi.
So cauldron, it's a ceramic cauldron. That we put dry ice in it, and there's like a plastic insert inside of it, so the dry ice is on the outside of the plastic, so it doesn't touch. I'm just telling you the cheat so that you guys can DIY your spooky mizusashi. There's like a plastic tube inside with the dry ice outside of the tube, so that the water in the tube is not affected by the dry ice, because you don't want to mix the two. And then we also put the mini glow sticks around the dry ice, so that when you pour the water onto the dry ice, the smoke is green.
And it's an effect that takes perfect timing.
Yes, it doesn't last for very long. You've got to time it just right.
Yeah, we did a couple test runs and we literally have to pour the water into this after the guests have started to use the sukubai. So usually the host is not in the room, but there's about a 15-second window between when that first guest is finishing at the sukubai and coming in the nijiriguchi that we had to get water in there and then get back in the mizuya and be unseen, which seems like a lot of time to cross a mat and a half, but it's really not. So, and then it only lasted just long enough to get everyone in the room and seated before it bubbled down, for lack of a better word. It still glowed and had a little bit of an essence, but where the mist from the dry ice filled the whole floor of the tea room while they were looking at the scroll only lasted for basically just long enough for the guests to come in the room. So again, big payoff.
It was worth it.
Yes,
it was so cool.
I actually still remember pictures from so it's stuck.
Oh, you've seen the picture?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Unless it was a copycat, but yeah.
Which we used it again a couple years later, just that effect. We didn't repeat this whole chaji, because by then the culture around that particular theme had changed. If again we touch on context, what makes sense in that time may not make sense now. So, but yeah, we have used the cauldron for other just more, I don't want to call it generic Halloween, but a less specific reference to Halloween. So there's a couple different images of it floating around.
I do want to give a couple of other little zingers from that chaji that I just have to point out that we did. So Lindsey is a Midori Kai graduate, so she has the coveted green fukusa. And she is associated with a particular part of said magical school who cares about the color green. And thanks to Urasenke, I was able to order a gold fukusa from some source. I don't even remember how I got a hold of a gold fukusa, because I happen to be associated with the gold house. Yep, I'm a Hufflepuff. Shocker, people. So we wore those fukusa instead of our normal colored fukusa. And all of our guests bought house socks and wore those instead of white socks in the tea room. This was an early version of spooky tea. We went off the rails. Oh, the other really great piece that we did was Lindsey's very, very creative. And she made a baby mandrake crawling out of its pot. It's super cool looking. And that was our flower for the second half, was this baby mandrake. And we put the baby mandrake. Was he on the Ita or was he on the Tokobashira?
We had him on the Ita.
Oh yeah, he was on the Ita, and then we hung earmuffs on the hook in the middle of the wall. Right, there's a hook in the back wall of the tokonoma. So we hung those earmuffs that you're supposed to wear when you're potting mandrakes so that they don't scream and kill you. We hung those on the hook. It was so cool. Like, there are a couple of things I just want to say to everyone. Number one, have fun. Like, yes, it's important that we understand our tradition and that we're respectful and that we are that we're doing these things with respect and accountability. And it's also okay if you try something and then afterwards you're like, that was super fun and it was a little much and I probably shouldn't do it again. This particular chaji, there's so much about it. Our guests had such a wonderful time. I figured out how to make butterbeer flavored mochi. I mean, life goals, people. And it was such a wonderful experience in so many ways. And there were also a lot of things that I think Lindsey and I both would say we learned from it about, actually, in hindsight, I'm not comfortable with how we stretched that particular line. I would not stretch that way again. And it's helped us find our, individually and as a pair of people who do tea together a lot, it's helped us find our voice. I don't know, that's probably not the right word, but hopefully people know what I mean.
Yeah, but I guess so I love how much you've put into these things, and it's clear that you're having a lot of fun with it. I guess what makes you, like, besides the fact that it's a bit much, do you think there's anything that from the guest perspective, or like what you created for the guests, that makes you feel like that you wouldn't do that again? Or is it just because it's over the top? Because the whole time it's like, it sounds like a really fun chaji, and like I think anybody would want to be part of either one, but obviously both of them would have very different feelings afterwards. Do you think you still created that tea feeling when you were doing so much, or do you think you kind of lost some of that?
That's the big question. Like, that to me, you just hit the nail on the head with that question, Anthony. Like, great, you created an experience, but in doing so, did the vibe forget tea altogether? Was tea just sort of in the background as, well, that's where you did it, was in a tea room? Because at that point, maybe there's a question, right? Maybe there's that for me was where I decided, I want to pull back a little bit, because I don't want to leave. I don't want this to be something else going on in the tea room.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of ties into that as well, I think, is also creating a set of expectations and deliverables. By doing these hugely over the top things that are very, very involved, I think sometimes, one, we lose that tea is the main focus here in the hype that gets created around the other things that are happening, especially for guests. You're saying, what is it that the guests might not, register with, or might have not been as good for the guests? And I think setting an expectation of something just totally wild after we did that chaji for the year or two right after it, it was like everyone was talking about spooky tea, right? And it sounded less like tea and doing a chaji and more like the Met Gala, right? Like it sounded like this big showy thing. And the more that I sit on how things matter to my guests, I get really, really honed in on what are my guests getting out of this? How are they coming into this? That's also something that as we're curating these chaji is we can't invite everyone. And in some of these more over the top ones or ones that we were doing in the earlier years, it felt like we had to include everyone.
Mm.
And so the more guests we got into the mix, the higher the expectations got, and the further away from the core of what a guest should be feeling as they're coming into this space drifted away, I think. You're so hyped up about like, ooh, what am I going to see? What's going to be different? What's going to be weird? What's the theme? And there's less of that focus on, I've been invited to a chaji. There's this level of expertise. There is, this value of me as a guest that the host feels that I'm ready to experience this and appreciate this, and I can go into this with my whole kokoro, my whole heart being ready to do this, right? Like you're really thinking about the tea aspect. So it kind of, yeah, again, it folds into what TJ is saying about, do we lose the tea or did we keep it? And setting your guests' expectations that tea is the expectation, not spooky tea, not Halloween. It is tea, capital T, tea is the expectation. And that should always be the expectation.
And just to circle back on what I said, and maybe this month I'm being the bad influence voice for all of the listeners of TeaLife Audio. I just really want to encourage people to find those edges, because I feel like so often I meet people, and I know Lindsey had this experience. Somebody came up to her and said, "Oh, it was about this chaji, actually, the Magic School chaji." And they said, "Oh, I saw the pictures. That looks so amazing. I could never do that."
Mm.
And my question is, why?
I asked them the same question.
Why can't you do that? And I understand, like, people feel uncertain about where the edges are. They feel uncertain about their relationship to the practice, especially if they're not Japanese. And all of those things are incredibly important and incredibly valid questions to be asking ourselves. And I don't experience tea as a space of fear. I experience it as a place where I can bring my whole self and show up. And, I joke with people all the time, like Lindsey and I did a bunch of work with the Botanic Gardens here in Denver this summer. And usually I'm the talking head for the demonstrations. I know everybody's surprised. But I often get the question like, oh, what happens if somebody makes a mistake in the tea room? Or what happens if something goes wrong? And, I always smile and jokingly say, well, that usually means, everybody in the room dies. Because I think we have this sort of projection that we can't make mistakes, or we can't go too far, because if we do, we rip the fabric of the universe or something. It's hopefully people who are listening have listened enough and heard my talking head enough that they know, like, this practice is at the heart of who I am. And I also am aware that at the end of the day, we're just making tea. We're not making life or death decisions. It's this incredibly beautiful, transformative practice in my world. And if something isn't quite right in the tea room today, I learn from it and I deepen. So giving myself the permission to try something new in the tea room has been incredibly important. And I feel really so grateful, because I have a teacher who has somehow allowed me to feel I mean, and she herself is Japanese. She's allowed me to feel like I have that space to try something. And she's also been really upfront and reflecting to me like, that feels a little far when you describe it to me, you know? And, but not in a way that's like shame on you, but just, that would not make me comfortable. She has said, like, that would not be comfortable for me, which is a really great piece of feedback without it being like shutting it down.
Mm.
And I'm also really grateful to have incredibly committed and open-hearted tea friends like Lindsey, and we have other tea people that we have really, our sort of circle of tea friends, right? These are not people that we're not in the same studio, we're not under the same teacher, they're not my students, right? These are our tea friends. We're very lucky to be in a space where we have enough tea people that there are students and there are co-students in the studios of our teachers. And then we also have our tea friends who are just other practitioners at roughly the same level who we get together and do tea with. We don't get together to study, we get together to have tea. And that's created a space where we really do have the opportunity to explore and succeed and fail and try again and give each other the grace to make the mistakes and also trust each other enough that we can say to each other, like Lindsey does tell me all the time, like, hey, you remember there are guests here? Because when I do koicha, I turn into a mountain, the room goes quiet, and that is where I want to keep everybody. Like, nope, nothing's moving. We are in the void, And for me, it's very nourishing, but Lindsey's really great at reminding me, like, it may not be nourishing for everybody in the room to stay in that stillness and just finding those spaces, because I also like feel it's very important that as hosts that we're also nourished in the process. Like, it's not, for me, it's not solely about my guests. Like, I'm also in the room. So finding how we can show up and bring our full selves and be with those other people who are bringing their full selves, hopefully, too.
And I think that's something that there is a cultural shift happening a little bit in some tea communities. It's definitely happening in our community here in Colorado, of the tea room not only being a space of learning and education, but also of safety. We've all come, our current community is very, very unique in how diverse it is. Almost all of us have come from teachers that are elsewhere, or have had, multiple teachers in their experience, right? Like, a lot of us move quite frequently, for jobs, for things outside of the tea world, right? And so we come together in spaces or people have different experiences where they may have had an instructor who they didn't connect with very well for one reason or another, or they, had a lot of anxiety going into the tea room. And so then when they come to a tea room here for the first time, that anxiety carries over, right? Because you're in a familiar space. And I think that that's something that is starting to change, of where, the tea room is a safe space as well as a learning space, as well as a space that honors tradition. Like, all of those things can exist together and not be mutually exclusive, right? Like, you don't have to come to the tea room and you make a mistake and it's shameful, or you can't, you're not allowed to do tamai for a public chakai until you have it 100% perfect, right? Like, creating this newer space where everyone can find themselves or bring themselves, like TJ was saying, but it's also safe to do so. I think that's a very new thing in the tea community. And I mean, I'm starting to see it pop up in other places as well. And TJ was saying we did a lot of work with our local botanic gardens. And one of the things that we made a priority was having students working in all aspects of that program all summer long. So we did a workshop where all these students who had never been in a museum before learned how to function in a chakai, right? And we were there supervising, overseeing, but anytime a mistake was made, it was, don't panic, we'll do it better next time, and there's not this, like you said, live or die aspect, but there's a sense of safety. And I think that that's something that the tea room should always be. Like when you're in contemplation, right? Some folks that are more spiritual in their practice with Zen or whatever, a place of contemplation is a safe space for the most part, generally speaking. You feel like you can take the time to do what you need to do. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the tea room should also hold that space and should not bring anxiety. But I think that's a very different kind of shift that we're starting to see.
Well, it sounds like Colorado is a great place to do tea. If there's anything from the talks with TJ and you, I always feel like, wow, this great community there, and that seems to foster creativity and allows people to push boundaries and find tea for themselves. And I think that's really, really wonderful. I don't think that exists most places. So
I think it's important that we're having those conversations, though, right? Especially in a context that this is not Japan. And no matter how hard we try, we will never be doing tea in Japan unless we are in Japan. And having some of those tough conversations, or giving, like you said, finding boundaries and pushing on them and realizing what is, because again, especially with the Halloween and spooky tea, there have been times where TJ and I have said, we can't do that, not necessarily because our guests won't get it, but more of like, this is a cultural practice. And this is another question we get very often, the appreciation versus appropriation.
I think we have a tendency in American culture, we want to have the appropriation conversation, and we want to imagine that we land in an answer and then it's done. We can check that box off. And actually, and I've spent several years teaching diversity and inclusivity in university settings with undergraduates. And I said this to them repeatedly, this is an ongoing conversation. And if you're really committed to diversity, equity, and inclusivity work, it never stops. You are constantly revisiting those questions. You are constantly in conversation about whatever is alive in the moment with those concepts. And also those conversations and those concepts are constantly evolving and changing as we get a better understanding culturally and socially of what it means to hold privilege, what it means to appreciate, what it means to appropriate. Those conversations are also growing and expanding all the time as well. So there's no landing point of how we show up. What there is an ongoing relationship to the questions about how do we show up authentically as non-Japanese Chajin? What are our responsibilities? What freedoms do we have? And how do we continue to genuinely, authentically show up and engage with that conversation in a way that is respectful not only of the tradition which we all love, but also respectful and authentic about ourselves and the culture from which we come. In a way, wrapping myself up in kimono and being an anachronism feels also problematic. Putting myself out there as if I am authentically Japanese or something, like that doesn't add up either, So it's a conversation, and it's a dynamic conversation that I hope won't end until I'm dead, and then I'll come back and haunt your tea room for spooky tea.
Perfect. I'm waiting for it. Like,
I'll be that very still ghost in the corner.
That's fine. Just don't knock anything over and we'll be fine.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I was really suspecting that our conversation about spooky tea would turn down this road of the tension that arises when we try to bring something that is so outside of the cultural tradition of Japan into the tea room. And I'm really glad. Like I want to have this conversation, and I hope that people, this is for all the listeners, please comment on Discord if you have things to say there. But I'm way more hopeful that you will have these conversations with the tea friends in your life. The internet is sort of a safe and easy place to voice our opinions, but have these conversations with the people that you're doing tea with, because these are really rich conversations. I mean, I'm not afraid or uncomfortable telling people that, after 15 years of doing tea and having my chame and being a teacher, I'm still growing. I'm still learning. I'm still deepening into my relationship with this practice. Gosh, I mean, even when I talk to that teacher, that senior most teacher in Omotesenke in the region, who, like I said, she's in her 80s. She's been doing tea since she was 6. I asked her about a year ago, like, Sensei, are you still learning things? Do you still feel like there's more? And her response, and I do believe it was a genuine answer, was every day I learn something new. Every time I go into the tea room, I learn something.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that for myself, I hope that for all of us, that as long as we continue to do this practice, that we continue to learn things about the practice and about ourselves and about each other. Yeah. And I hope we give ourselves permission to make big mistakes in the tea room.
Best way to learn.
Because no one will die. No one will die in the tea room.
No one will die.
It'll be okay.
And you know what? I've said to people many times that I would prefer that when the moment of my death does arrive, I'd like to be doing tea when it happens. So if they do die, there are worse places to die than in the tea room.
Definitely.
Should we talk about a scroll?
Yes, let's.
Okay. So we pulled a scroll for today that actually, this was the scroll that we used for the yokai chaji last year. So let's hope my Japanese pronunciation is okay. Kaimon raku o-oshi. Kaimon raku o-oshi. There is a variation in how these kanji can be read. Totally different. Mon wo hirakeba raku o-oshi. Mon wo hirakeba raku o-oshi. And the translation it's tricky as a translation, so I'm going to give you sort of how I've tried to piece it together as a translation. Opening my door only leaves. Or opening my door leaves piled. Something like that. It suggests that you open the door and what you discover is a heap of leaves. Okay. So I'm going to talk about like traditionally how this phrase is understood, and I'm going to let Lindsey talk about an alternative. So really, this is just a false statement. The poem from which it's taken, or the text from which it's taken, is sort of contextualizing this phrase as the season is changing and the leaves are turning, and I feel the turning of the season. And then I opened my door and the leaves had piled up. They're all falling from the trees and they've just piled in front of my door. So it's got this sort of beautiful feeling of the season. There's a suggestion maybe of wind or of the ways in which autumn comes on suddenly, and you open your door one morning and there they are, this carpet of flowers, or leaves that are like flowers. So that's a beautiful image. Yeah.
So on the flip side of that, we see the traditions and transitions of autumn, but also think about how you're feeling during autumn. It's late in the evening, the sun's gone down, there's a knock at your door. You get to the door, and all that's there is leaves. But you heard the knock. You heard it. You heard it. But there's no one at the door. Totally different context. And totally, it is a quintessentially autumn feeling, at least for me, right? To have that there's that chill in the air and like that little tingle in your spine that like, ooh, something's here, something's changed, something's different. And so we use that scroll for that chaji to, again, allude to something that may or may not be there when you open your door in the autumn. Kind of unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah. It's fun that you can play with the 5 characters and put them in a certain context like that.
Right. I mean, that's, again, just sort of giving ourselves the space, especially around a holiday like Halloween, when there is a playful vibe in the air. There's a little bit of mischief afoot. So part of the mischief is reading the scroll differently. I think about other scrolls that I have, which I know for a fact are part of a pair. I have a scroll that is this particular phrase, and having gone and done research on the phrase, we found the pairing phrase that goes with it, and it contextualizes the scroll that I have very particularly. It sets it in autumn specifically. It's a very particular statement. But if you just read the scroll, not knowing where it came from, what the original context, what the pairing phrase is, the phrase itself that I have on the scroll can have much broader range of meanings. So, it's really important, I think, and really useful for us to understand the context out of which these phrases, these zengo, come. And I also don't know that we have to be totally wedded to that's what it means, especially because our guests probably won't know the reference. They probably won't hear that phrase and be like, oh, that pairs with this. Most of us are not going to have that context floating around inside of our heads. So I think this scroll was a lot of fun to use and really did play into our theme of, I don't know, when we did this yokai chaji, one of the images that I kept thinking about as we were planning was, what if you were having just a straight up normal chaji, but it was in an old sort of rundown, machi-ai townhouse. Is that the right word? Did I just use the wrong word?
No, a machi-ai. Yeah.
Machi-ai townhouse.
Machi-ai. Yeah. There's a couple different based on the type of house it is, but
yeah. So just like an old school traditional house where like there were holes in the shoji and things were a little dingy and scratched, and it was nighttime and there wasn't anything strange going on and from the host, but the house itself might not be just a normal room. That was sort of the vibe that I kept thinking about, and the image I kept thinking about was, a little tear in the shoji screen, and did I just see an eye look through it? That feeling of, oh, nothing's wrong in the room, but something's not quite normal. And that scroll really, when we read it that way, it really took on that feeling for me too, of just, what do you mean there's a pile of leaves outside the door?
And I should also add the little asterisk of, if I remember correctly, we did not tell the guests what we interpreted the scroll as. We just said, at my door, only leaves.
Yep.
And then when they left, there was a pile of leaves at the door. But But again, they've gone through this whole series of sensations and feelings about, like TJ was saying, being in a space where maybe there is something a little different here. Maybe there's something that's not quite usual. And then when they leave, it whether they caught it or not, they're thinking about that scroll on the way out because they've gone through all these other things. What does that really mean if it doesn't mean what I think it means?
Mhm. Yeah, I hope people do try to explore some of these other times of the year, these things that are not part of the traditional Japanese calendar. I know over the years, Marius has talked about some of the things that he does around holidays that matter to him.
Mhm.
I'm thinking particularly about is it New Year's where he does a whole thing?
Yeah, he does a New Year's and some other national pride thing.
Oh yeah, National Day or what? Like they're the equivalent of Fourth of July, yeah, for America. So yeah, just finding ways to observe moments that matter to us within the frame of this cultural practice that means so very much to all of us. I mean, spooky tea is always this like incredibly fun thing that we do, but a lot of people know that Lindsey and I plan spooky tea sometimes 8 months in advance, and some of these conversations we've been having for multiple years
I
about
have
certain.
a notebook full of ideas that we just crack it open when we decide it's time and start running through things.
But I don't know that people realize that an active part of that conversation is the conversation around respect and what is appropriate and how do we keep tea at the center and how do we not just turn this into a kooky Halloween party in the tea room. We're having really meaningful conversations about our relationship to this practice, alongside how do we give them the chills between Koicha and Uscha. Yeah, it's a really interesting and active dialogue that we're going through every year when we start talking about spooky tea.
And I think that those conversations have also created a launching point for us to engage with other seasons that we didn't think about as much before. One of the things that, as we've kind of developed our more subtle energies for these chaji, is I came to TJ out of the blue and said, I want a dead of winter chaji. I'm not talking like an asa chaji that's, just happens to be when it's super cold outside. Like, I want you to feel like you are out in the snow alone and like that solitude. And of course, I come to someone who thrives in the solitude of their practice in tea, right? I am not, that is not something that I generally explore. I'm the warmth. I think about my guests more than I think about myself sometimes. And so I came, but that was like a new feeling for me when I talked about that. And that's deep winter right there. That's a
Mhm.
totally different thing than, autumn. And so I think that even though we're using all these examples of, spooky tea and Halloween and, scary things, like think about the seasons that like maybe you haven't encountered before. How do I think about summer differently? How do I think about deep winter differently? Like how is this one conversation for a season that I love? How can it create a conversation in another season where I can bring that same energy and focus to another season as well? I'm learning how to deepen my engagement with all the seasons by having one season that has stood out for so long that now I'm starting to have these ideas about like, yeah, a deep winter chaji, and I need someone to help me kind of manifest those because that's not a space that I usually play in. So again, you're forced is maybe a strong word, but you to engage with your tea friends, your community, and say, hey, I know you are all about summer, and I really want to experience summer the way that you experience summer, or I want to create an experience for someone who loves that season. even though we have this one core thing that we really love, it's led us into other things too. And like TJ talked about doing a chaji at some point in the future with the 5 colors, forgive me,
Five colors and 5 elements.
yes, 5 colors and 5 elements, which never in a million years would I have come up with that idea. But because we get to having these sessions and these conversations around meeting traditions and meeting people in different cultural spaces, I think it's really deepened those other places for us to find creativity that maybe are something that we wouldn't have gotten to before if we were just sticking to, okay, we need to do a fall chaji and it has to be about momiji and the changing leaves and it just has to be autumn, or it just has to be hanami, it just has to be sakura, right? Like we're able to have really dynamic conversations. And I mean, it boils down to give us another reason to do chaji. Like, just give me a reason. I think some of our newer community members are constantly surprised that they say, "Oh, we'd love to go to chaji," and we say, "Okay, sure, why not? Let's do it. What do you want to do?" And just like the instant willingness to explore that conversation and not back away from chaji are a lot of work. They should not be scary. Unless you're creating a Halloween chaji, then it should be a little scary. But like you should be able to engage with that level of your practice without the fear of doing it. Because there are some folks I think that I have spoken to who, oh gosh, I could never be a host for a chaji. That's so scary. What about that is scary? What's intimidating? What's frightening? How as a fellow tea person can I support you to get you to this integral part of our practice? We don't just do keiko for keiko. We do it for one, for practice, for two, for our heart. For a lot of us, it's a contemplative space that a lot of us enter. And we do it so we can learn how to do chaji is the byline, right? Like you do keiko so you can do chaji is one of the bylines we hear often. And I think that you shouldn't be scared to do it. There's always a reason to have tea, and there's always a reason to do a chaji. You just got to think of all the details.
And if it's not perfect, that's okay.
That is okay.
And will you be doing another spooky tea this year, or?
Spooky tea this year, I think, is just going to be a very quiet tea with friends. It will be spooky, but I think a full-blown chaji is all the moving parts this year are not quite coalescing. We had a lot of, again, a busy season of programming. We've got some career changes going on. We're welcoming a bunch of community members that are very new. And so I think this year we might just have TJ's dream of a contemplative, quiet, spooky tea.
Gonna strengthen my little black kokoro.
Yes, exactly. So I'll have to sit quietly for the whole thing. That's the most horrifying part of it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's I wish that for everybody, honestly, that somewhere in your practice of tea, there is this nourishment of who you are as a chajin, and you don't have to be anybody else's version of a chajin, right? You can be your version of a chajin and just be nourished by this incredible space and practice that we have.
That might be a nice place to leave it. Thank you everyone for listening. Lindsey, thank you for joining us as a guest. And
of course.
Yeah, it was great. And it was great to see you, Anthony, and have you join us in these questions and conversations. And I don't know, maybe we should ask one quick question. Has anybody got anything? I mean, Lindsey and I just talked about some kind of spooky tea, some quiet spooky tea with some other tea friends. But Anthony, have you got anything coming up that's super exciting that you're looking forward to?
The biggest thing is I'm going to Japan in November, so I don't want to be doing any big events before then because I have to focus on everything else so I could let go of everything when I go over there, which I really need at this point, even though it hasn't been that that long, about a year and a half by the time we go, but I think the family needs it and I need it, and I look forward to doing tea in Kyoto and spending time with my wife's family and all of that. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, both of you. It's been super great, and I hope you have a wonderful spooky season. And thank you, everybody that's joined us. We really appreciate your comments and your attention, and we also are really appreciative that you're out there doing tea as well. So thank you for listening.
thank you.
This has been a production of TeaLife Audio. Producing an episode requires a bit of time and money. We do the work for free and hope you will help us cover the cost. Go to tealife.audio/support to help us bring another episode to your tea world. The taste of matcha when there is no one to talk tea. TeaLife Audio.